The hour before dawn on the Louisiana Bayou is a strange country of its own, where fog coils over black water and every sound carries like a whispered threat. On the night of August 16, 1847, that darkness held a secret the parish would try for decades to erase. Belle Rive Plantation, 2,000 acres of sugarcane stretching from the Teche to the cypress swamps, stood silent except for the sigh of night insects and the wet slap of washhouse linens. According to a fragile scrap from the St. Mary Parish Court Ledger, one of only 3 pages that survived a courthouse fire in 1853, Mistress Elise Boudreau was found deceased, face submerged in a copper basin of scalding water, 'cause undetermined. That single sentence is all the official world chose to remember. Yet the whispers that seeped through the quarters and across the river told a far more deliberate story, a story that begins in the low-roofed laundry room where steam rolled like a living thing and 8 enslaved women, Amara, Bess, Charity, Dinah, Fanny, Grace, Leah, and Ruth, worked bare-armed through the oppressive heat. For years they had bent over the mistress's silks and the master's starched collars while the scent of lies stung their throats. Each woman carried her own quiet scars. Children sold, backs lashed, nights broken by the sound of keys turning in the overseer's lock. An excerpt from an 1847 issue of the New Orleans Times makes only a cryptic reference to a domestic disturbance of regrettable conclusion, but an abolitionist pamphlet printed in Philadelphia months later speaks more plainly. Certain colored women of Belle Rive did lay hands upon their mistress and drown her in a wash basin after grievous abuses beyond endurance. The pamphlet never reached the South in large numbers. Bundles were confiscated at river ports and parish officials dismissed it as Yankee libel. But oral histories collected a century later by Works Progress Administration interviewers echo the same refrain. One elderly woman, identifying herself only as ML, told a young field worker, "My grandmama say the water remember. Say 8 of 'em hold her down till the steam went quiet." Imagine that room. The hiss of iron kettles. The copper basin brimming with boiling water drawn from the great hearth. Elise Boudreau, the mistress whose moods flared like the August heat, bursts in furious that a silk chemise has been scorched. Perhaps she has been drinking brandy, perhaps the night has already given her reason to punish. We can only piece it together from fragments. An overseer's diary noting discipline administered to the laundresses earlier that week. A bill of sale showing Amara's infant boy transferred to a neighboring planter the very day before. What we know for certain is that by dawn the mistress lay lifeless, the steam of the basin rising around her still form, and 8 women stood at the threshold of a freedom they could scarcely name. The official coroner's report, another half-charred relic, calls it an unfortunate accident. No mention of struggle. No testimony from the enslaved. Yet the very absence of their words shouts across the silence. Why would a healthy 34-year-old woman drown in a shallow basin unless other hands guided her under? Why did the parish militia mobilize within hours, scouring the quarters with bloodhounds, if this were mere misfortune? The questions linger like the metallic tang of steam on iron. Belle Rive itself tried to swallow the memory. Within a year the laundry house was torn down and the ground salted. Neighbors were warned not to speak of the incident, and those who did found their names struck from church rolls. But the land remembers. Local children still dare each other to walk the old levee on moonless nights, where they say a woman's cry mingles with the hiss of boiling water. Some elders hum a wordless hymn when they pass the cypress hollow, a tune that never found its way into hymnals yet carries the cadence of defiance. Archival shards, ledgers, runaway notices, half-burned depositions, give us only glimpses, but even these fragments point toward something the written record fears to name, an act of collective will by 8 women who refused to die unnamed and unavenged. Was it cold-blooded murder, or the final assertion of their humanity in a world that denied they possessed souls at all? Did they know the price they would pay, or was the act itself a liberation worth the gallows? History, scrubbed clean by those in power, will not answer. But the echoes remain. As we open this long-hidden file, you may feel the unease of truths America tried to drown with Elise Boudreau. Listen closely to the creak of old floorboards, to the stories your own elders half-finished before changing the subject. Because sometimes the past is not past, it waits in the dark, patient as the bayou fog. If your grandmother ever whispered of a night when the water would not cool, if you've seen a name scratched out in an old family Bible or heard a hymn about steam and silence, write it below and subscribe. Every voice, every comment, every remembered fragment brings another lost story back into the light, and ensures that the women of Belle Rive are never erased again. By daylight the Belle Rive plantation looked almost serene, a mirage of whitewashed symmetry rising from the slow green curves of the Louisiana Bayou, but serenity here was a mask stretched tight across a machinery of unrelenting cruelty. According to the 1840 agricultural census for St. Mary Parish, Belle Rive boasted more than 2,000 acres of sugar cane and rice, its yearly output rivaling the grand estates along the Mississippi itself. The records list 137 enslaved people, men, women, and children, each reduced to an age, a sex, and a dollar value, their humanity compressed into neat columns of ink that hid the sweat, the broken backs, the stolen lives that fed the estate's impossible wealth. Travelers approaching by skiff on the Teche River would have first glimpsed the long avenue of moss-laced oaks, their branches like giant arms trying to shield the quarters beyond. Beyond that canopy the main house shimmered in the swamp light, a false temple of Greek revival columns that gleamed like bleached bones against the dark cypress swamp. Overseer diaries from 1845 describe the house as the grandest in the parish, with marble mantels hauled upriver from New Orleans and a ballroom floor polished so bright, a man could see his own reflection as if he were standing over water. Yet the house's beauty was a cruel joke to those who built and maintained it. In a letter now held in the historic New Orleans collection, a visiting merchant praised the tireless Negroes whose hands shaped the very charm of this place, unwittingly confessing the truth that every brick of elegance rested on the backs of the enslaved. The workday began before the first blush of dawn. A cracked iron bell, still rusting in the parish museum, ripped through the night while the moon was high, summoning field gangs to the cane rows where the air smelled of wet earth and stagnant bayou water. Overseer Samuel Kittredge, whose diary survived in fragments, wrote in November 1846, "Cutting begun at 4:30. Slaves in fine form. 2 required chastisement." That single cold sentence hides the hiss of cane knives slicing through stalks taller than a man, the gnats biting at sweat-slick skin, the screams that followed when chastisement meant the lash. By midday the air itself seemed to boil. Mosquitoes swarmed so thick a man could wipe his arm and reveal blood in the streak, but the cutting never stopped. Sugar waits for no one. The harvest was a race against rot. Inside the big house, a different cruelty played out. House slaves rose even earlier, lighting fires, drawing water, pressing linen until the mistress's silks lay smooth as poured milk. Amara and Dinah, whose names appear on a 1844 bill of sale, were listed as laundresses and domestic. Their tasks were endless: scouring floors, carrying steaming kettles, emptying chamber pots, dressing the mistress in imported gowns while enduring her sudden rages. One overseer's account complains of the Negro women's slow obedience when corrected, a phrase that barely conceals the daily threat of blows or worse. Punishments were spectacles: a whipping post near the carriage house where children were forced to watch, the crack of rawhide echoing through the oak alley so every soul would remember. The bayou itself seemed to absorb the pain. Cypress knees jutted from black water like the bones of the unburied. At night, when the fields finally quieted, a heavy chorus of frogs and cicadas rose like a single heartbeat. From the quarters drifted low songs in a language the masters pretended not to recognize, fragments of West African rhythms braided with whispers of the Psalms, coded hymns carrying both lament and directions for escape. Oral history collected by the Works Progress Administration nearly a century later records an old woman named Celeste saying, "We sang to keep the devil from our throat and to tell each other where the moonlight road began." Yet even in song there was no sanctuary from the endless ledger of profit. According to parish tax records from 1846, Belle Rive's annual yield exceeded 400 hogsheads of sugar and 1,000 barrels of rice, a fortune that allowed the Boudreau family to purchase more land, more tools, and most chillingly more people. Children were born only to be listed as future capital. Marriage among the enslaved existed only at the owner's convenience, broken the moment a higher price appeared at a neighboring plantation. A will from Patriarch Henri Boudreau, dated 1839, bequeaths all Negro property, their issue and increase to his heirs, a phrase that treats human reproduction as a renewable crop, another field to harvest. Visitors often commented on the oppressive heat, but few understood that the true climate of Belle Rive was fear. The mistress, Elise Boudreau, wielded that fear like a polished cane. A merchant's wife from New Orleans wrote in a private letter, "Madame Elise possesses a temper most singular, capable of radiant charm at supper and of dreadful severity at morning's first light." Folklore remembers her differently, as a woman whose cruelty fermented like the bayou's stagnant water, who delighted in breaking spirits as if snapping a reed. Children in the quarters would later whisper that her footsteps sounded like the rustle of a cottonmouth, soft and deadly. Through all of this, the land itself bore silent witness. Cypress roots drank the spilled blood, and the slow Teche current carried away tears no one counted. The plantation records tell us Belle Rive flourished, but they cannot capture the way the air felt heavy with despair, or how the moonlight caught on the sweat of backs bent double, or how the night creatures seemed to echo the muffled sobs of mothers who had lost their children to distant markets. Those truths survive only in the stories passed from mouth to mouth, stories that surface when the wind is right and the moss stirs as though listening. To walk those fields today, where sugarcane still rustles in late summer wind, is to feel a pressure beneath the soil, a sense that the earth remembers every name struck from the ledger. The elegant house, long abandoned, sags behind vines, its marble mantel stained with mildew, but if you press your ear to the cracked plaster you might still hear the bell that once split the night, the rhythm of songs meant for freedom, the low thunder of countless footsteps forced toward endless labor. And as we turn from these oaks and their silent witnesses, we must ask what wealth built on such relentless suffering truly means. The columns still stand, the profits long spent, but the human cost lingers like the swamp fog at dusk, a debt that can never be repaid and will never be forgotten. If your family has ever spoken in half sentences about a name lost in a bill of sale or a hymn sung only at night, share it below and subscribe, because every memory spoken aloud helps lift the veil that Belle Rive in places like it tried to draw forever across the dark waters of their history. In the brittle handwriting of an 1844 bill of sale, the lives of 8 women appear as nothing more than inventory: Amara age 28, Bess 30, Charity 26, Dinah 25, Fanny 23, Grace 29, Leah 27, Ruth 24. Their prices stand in neat columns: $700, $675, $690, as though each heartbeat could be weighed and tallied alongside the barrels of sugar stacked on Belle Rive's wharf. The paper crackles like dry leaves in the archive room of the St. Mary Parish Courthouse, where humidity has blurred the ink but not the meaning. They were property recorded with the same detached precision as a mule or a plow. Yet every faded letter hides the complexity of lives lived in stolen time. Parish baptism records reveal that Amara carried a daughter to the font of St. Martin Catholic Church on a rain-swollen April morning in 1845, the priest noting the child's name as Eliza and adding the casual Latin phrase mater sola, mother alone. No father listed, no lineage allowed. The next record of Eliza ends abruptly, a gap where a burial notice should be, and oral history whispers that she was sold at 16 months to a trader bound for Natchez. Census rolls from 1840 and 1850 describe Belle Rive's enslaved people in columns of age and gender: 4 females under 10, 6 females 10 to 24, 2 males 60 and above. To the clerks these were statistics. To the women of the quarters they were husbands torn away, infants hidden under quilts during inspections, sisters who hummed songs of longing in the moonlight. Overseer Samuel Kittredge's diary mentions Leah as apt in medicine, a hint of the herbal knowledge passed through generations, a skill both respected and feared by those who sought to control her. In another brittle entry he notes that Charity shows resistance in the eyes, a phrase that carries more threat than a page can hold. Each woman carried a constellation of memory that no ledger could capture. Fanny, barely 23, is said to have traced patterns in the dirt at night, recalling the river paths of her mother's village in the Bight of Benin. Dinah, skilled with a needle, embroidered tiny marks inside the hems of her mistress's gowns, symbols of rivers and birds meant to remind her that freedom existed somewhere beyond the bayou. Oral tradition collected by Works Progress Administration interviewers in the 1930s preserves a story of Miss Ruth who sings soft to the trees so the wind take her words. In these fragments the women speak at last, though history tried to silence them. Family ties among the enslaved were fragile, like spider silk across the cane fields, easily torn by a planter's whim. A single sale could unspool a lifetime. According to a parish probate inventory from 1846, Bess's son Jacob, age 4, was loaned to a neighboring plantation as partial payment for a shipment of iron. No note records his return. When Bess is mentioned again in a medical ledger for 1847, she is described simply as sullen. The word sits like a bruise on the page, a cold shorthand for a mother who has lost the light of her child. Even moments of love and connection were shadowed by the threat of separation. Marriages were often performed by elders with whispered vows and the symbolic crossing of broomsticks, ceremonies unrecognized by law but fiercely defended by those who knew the power of a promise. Amara and a field hand named Josiah jumped the broom beneath a blood moon, their union noted only in the memories of those who dared witness. Within a year Josiah was sold to a trader heading west, and Amara's next appearance in the record is as laundress, her marriage scrubbed away by commerce. At night, when the swamp fog rolled in thick as breath, The women gathered outside the quarters to share the stories that kept them alive. They spoke of ancestors who crossed oceans, of spirits that guarded children's dreams, of rivers that led to freedom if one listened to the stars. Grace, the eldest, told of an African queen who turned herself into a bird to escape capture, a tale that flickered like candlelight in the darkness and made the children believe that the human spirit could slip any cage. These stories, never written, survive only in echoes passed from grandmother to grandchild, a defiance stronger than any chain. The ledgers, of course, tell none of this. They record values, not love, weights, not songs. But if you press your ear to the pages, you can almost hear the low hum of their resilience, the shared breaths in the laundry house where steam curled like ghosts around the rafters. Each woman bore her own grief, Amara for the child sold away, Leah for the mother left on a Carolina dock, Dinah for the brother who vanished into a trader's coffle bound for Texas. But together they formed a quiet republic of survival, a sisterhood bound not by law but by unbreakable need. The mistress, Elise Boudreau, moved among them like a storm cloud, her demands a constant pressure. Overseer notes mention her fondness for correction, a euphemism that cannot hide the crack of whips or the sudden blows of an iron poker. The women learned to mask their hatred beneath lowered eyes, but in the secret language of song they named her Ma Diallo, the water demon, a warning and a prophecy. One WPA interview from 1937 recounts an old spiritual sung softly, "Water take the wicked, water set us free." The words, half prayer and half promise, would linger for generations. These women existed between erasure and endurance. Their names, Amara, Bess, Charity, Dinah, Fanny, Grace, Leah, Ruth, remain ink on fragile paper, yet their lives ripple outward like the bayou itself, impossible to dam. Each record we recover is a heartbeat restored, a reminder that history's silence is never complete. And as we read their names aloud today, the question rises like mist off the techa. How many more voices lie hidden in forgotten ledgers, waiting for someone to listen? The ink fades, the paper crumbles, but the memory of their defiance seeps into the soil and refuses to die. If your family keeps a Bible with a name scratched out or a song your grandmother sang without explanation, share it below and subscribe, because every remembered story brings these women back from the margins and makes sure the ledger can never close. Before the first trace of dawn touched the cypress crowns, the iron bell of Belle Rive clanged like a hammer on the skull, shattering the fragile dark. Its echo rolled across the bayou, a sound as constant and merciless as the tide, summoning every soul from pallet and straw to the long day of labor that defined their existence. Overseer Samuel Kittredge wrote in his 1846 diary, "Bell rung at 3:45. Negroes accounted for by 4. Work to commence immediately upon inspection." The cold precision of that line belies what it meant. Men and women stumbling barefoot through dew-soaked grass, their bodies aching from yesterday's cuts, the whip's memory still fresh on their backs, the weight of another endless day settling like iron on their lungs. Sugar was a cruel crop, a master that demanded obedience from both slave and soil. The cane rose higher than a man's head, its edges sharp enough to slice skin, and in the heavy August air the stalks exhaled a sweet rot that clung to the throat. From first light until dusk, the field hands swung their knives in a relentless rhythm, the hiss of cut cane merging with the drone of cicadas. Parish agricultural reports of 1845 boast that Belle Rive produced over 400 hogsheads of sugar that year, but those neat figures hide the human toll. Backs bent until spines warped, fingers stiff from the blade, children tending boiling kettles where a splash of syrup could sear flesh to the bone. Inside the big house the work was no gentler, only quieter. Amara and Dinah, the laundresses whose names barely survive in brittle bills of sale, began their tasks in a haze of steam long before sunrise. They hauled buckets of water from the cistern, stoked fires until the hearth glowed white, and bent over copper basins heavy enough to warp the arms of the strongest man. A single misstep, a scorch on a chemise, a tear in a lace cuff, could bring the sudden crack of the mistress's cane or a command for correction, carried out by the overseer with cold efficiency. Overseer notes from March 1847 record, without a tremor, 2 women disciplined for slowness in the laundry, an entry that conceals screams swallowed by brick walls and the smell of singed flesh that clung long after punishment ended. Silence became a shield. In the quarters, speech was careful, eyes averted when patrols passed. But silence also carried its own language. The women braided maps into each other's hair, patterns of rivers and stars that pointed toward the possibility of escape. They folded messages into the lilting melodies of their songs, spirituals that to a careless master sounded like prayer but to the enslaved were instructions and comfort. A low chant recorded by a Works Progress Administration interviewer nearly a century later repeats the refrain, steal away home, its soft cadence hiding a direction toward the marsh where sympathetic fishermen might wait. Meals were sparse and hurried. Cornmeal mush at dawn, salted pork when available, greens foraged from the edges of the fields. Hunger gnawed constantly, yet even in meager fare the women found ways to claim a sliver of autonomy. Leah, known for her knowledge of herbs, slipped bitterroot into evening stews not for flavor but for healing, countering fevers, easing the monthly pains that no one else acknowledged. Her remedies traveled quietly from hand to hand, a network of care that defied the overseer's watch. Night offered no true rest. The air inside the quarters hung thick and damp, carrying the distant calls of owls and the nearer creak of boots when patrols prowled. The threat of sudden intrusion, by overseer, by master, by hired hunter, never lifted. Children learned early to still their breathing when keys rattled at the door. Grace, the eldest of the 8, kept a small pouch of river stones beside her mat, each stone a memory of someone stolen or lost. "Hold them tight," she whispered to the younger girls, "so you remember you are more than this." Those stones, smooth from countless palms, were a quiet assertion of identity the ledger could not erase. Punishment hovered like humidity. Whippings were public, a theater of terror designed to splinter solidarity. The whipping post stood near the carriage house, its wood dark with the oil of countless storms and the blood of countless backs. An 1846 parish doctor's record notes treating a Negro woman for excessive laceration following correction, a sterile phrase for flesh flayed until infection set in. Yet even in this calculated cruelty, a flicker of defiance survived. After each punishment the quarters gathered, humming low songs that wound through the dark like threads of invisible light, a music that said, "We see you, we will remember." Some nights, when the moon sank behind thunderclouds and the swamp fog rolled thick as breath, stories rose from the shadows. Tales of ancestors who could shift into birds and fly north, of rivers that opened to swallow the wicked, of spirits that watched over children when mothers could not. Oral tradition later recalled these gatherings as more than comfort. They were strategy, teaching patience, unity, the belief that the present nightmare was not eternal. Ruth often led these sessions, her voice soft yet unyielding as she spoke of a future carved from courage. Through it all, the Mistress Elise Boudreau moved like a storm front, sudden and violent. Her temper lashed as sharply as any whip. A merchant's wife visiting in 1846 described her as capable of great charm when receiving guests, but prone to fits of ungovernable fury among her servants. The enslaved women called her Ma Dielo, the water demon, a name whispered with both fear and prophecy, for water would indeed one day claim her. They sang a quiet hymn in the laundry, words drifting like steam, "Water washed the wicked, water set us free." To an outsider it was merely a work song. To those who knew, it was a promise. Life under the yoke demanded more than endurance. It demanded the subtle art of survival, the ability to hide anger behind lowered eyes, to weave messages into melody, to keep a spark of self alive while every force conspired to extinguish it. The ledgers recorded only labor and output, never the heartbeat of quiet rebellion that pulsed through every gesture, every glance, every note of a midnight hymn. When we read the census columns and overseer diaries today, we see numbers and terse phrases, but if we listen closely we can almost hear the muffled chorus beneath. The scrape of knives and cane, the hiss of boiling kettles, the low hum of a people determined to remember who they were. And so the question lingers in the heavy Louisiana air: how many dreams, how many whispered plans for freedom, were carried off by the Teche River's slow current, never to be written yet never truly lost? If your family keeps a fragment of a song or a story told only in the hush of evening, share it below and subscribe, because every remembered note brings back the voices Belle Rive tried to silence. The summer of 1847 pressed down on St. Mary Parish like a clenched fist. Heat shimmered above the cane fields, thick enough to taste, and even the cypress shadows felt airless. According to a single brittle line in the Belle Rive overseer's ledger, one of the few that escaped the courthouse fire, June 18th, Mistress in violent humor, correction administered to several women for defiance in the washhouse. That bland sentence is all the official record admits. But oral history from the bayou carries another version, heavier and sharper, of a night when the women who toiled in the steaming laundry began to weigh a final, irreversible act. Elise Boudreau's rages had always been sudden, but by that summer they turned calculated and cruel. Guests spoke of a lady of mercurial temperament, but the enslaved knew her as Ma Dielo, the water demon. She delighted in humiliation, forcing Amara to scrub lace cuffs until her hands bled, ordering Grace to stand in the courtyard while mosquitoes fed on her skin. Overseer Samuel Kittredge recorded a need for discipline when Ruth refused to present herself after a beating. The phrase conceals a night when Ruth's child was torn from her arms and sent upriver to another plantation, his name scratched from the ledger as though he had never drawn breath. That loss became the ember that would not cool. Each evening after the bell released them, the women gathered in the shadow of the washhouse chimney, where steam drifted like restless spirits and the hiss of cooling water masked their whispers. Leah traced lines in the dirt with a stick, routes through the marsh, the timing of patrols, the moments when the mistress bathed alone. Their plans were not yet murder, they were prayers for deliverance, sketches of escape. But the bayou swallowed the sound of their hopes, and every dawn brought the same clang of iron, the same lash of command. Then came the scalding. Folklore says it was Dinah who bore it, a kettle of boiling lye water overturned by Elise's careless hand, or perhaps poured with deliberate malice. Dinah's back blistered in seconds, skin peeling like the bark of the cypress. Kittredge's diary merely notes, accident in laundry, girl incapacitated. He did not mention the smell of burning flesh, or the way Dinah's screams traveled down the rows of cane like a warning bell. For the women of Belle Rive, that was the moment when escape and endurance collapsed into a single dark thought. Justice could come only through blood and water. Night after night they met again, voices low, songs bending into coded counsel. Steal away, they hummed, but now the words meant more than flight. Grace produced a small pouch of powdered bitterroot, harmless in stew, deadly in the right measure. Leah suggested the cistern, the one place the mistress visited without escort when she came to berate the laundresses. Amara, the quietest, spoke last. Water brought us here. Water can take her back. The swamps seemed to conspire with them. Rain swelled the Teche River until its black water lapped at the plantation's edges, and frogs croaked like muffled drums. Even the overseer kept to his quarters when thunder rolled. The women read these omens as sanction, a sign that the spirits of their ancestors, those who had survived the Middle Passage only to perish in the cane, were stirring. WPA interviews collected generations later preserve fragments of a chant said to be theirs. River keep the secret, river carry pain. By late August the decision was no longer spoken aloud. It lived in glances and the rhythm of their work. They studied the mistress's habits with the patience of hunters. Elise favored late evening visits to the laundry, where she liked to gloat over freshly ironed linens and berate the women for imagined slights. She often came alone, a single candle flickering against the brick walls. The wash basin, a wide copper bowl big enough to drown a child, waited in the corner, filled each night with scalding water for the final rinse. On the eve of the storm that would sweep the bayou clean, the women moved as one. Oral accounts describe a silence heavier than the air itself, a stillness so deep the insects ceased their song. Grace carried the pouch of bitterroot in her fist. Leah and Ruth hauled extra buckets to the basin until the water nearly overflowed. Amara stood by the door, her face unreadable. When the candlelight stretched long shadows across the floor and the first distant thunder muttered over the cypress, they knew the hour had arrived. No court record details their final vow. The St. Mary Parish docket for that week remains charred and half illegible. Yet a faded entry in the 1847 New Orleans Daily Picayune notes cryptically, "Disturbance at Belle Rive, domestic matter, no fatalities reported," a line so dismissive it all but proves a deeper truth. Something happened that officials meant to bury. The women themselves left only the language of water and fire, of whispered hymns and the hush before lightning strikes. Every rebellion has a breaking point, a single instant when pain hardens into purpose. For the 8 women of Belle Rive, that instant came beneath the low rafters of a scalding washhouse, where the hiss of boiling water mingled with the quiet certainty that the mistress who tormented them would soon face the same element she used to punish. The world outside remained deaf to their suffering, but in the shadows they heard a different verdict, one carried on the breath of their ancestors. Enough. And so the night itself seemed to lean closer, listening as the plan settled like a storm in their bones, waiting for the moment when silence would turn to action and the dark water of the basin would close over more than linen. If you have ever heard a family story of a name blotted out or a secret kept behind locked lips, share it below and subscribe, because every remembered whisper brings another buried truth back into the light. The night of August 24, 1847, broke heavy with a storm that seemed to prowl the Louisiana sky like a restless predator. Rain hissed through the cane fields and rattled the shutters of Belle Rive Plantation. The Teche River swelled dark and high, its surface shimmering with lightning. According to a surviving scrap from the St. Mary Parish court ledger, one brown corner spared by fire, Mistress Elise Boudreau found deceased in laundry house. Circumstances unusual. No witness statement survives beyond that terse line, but the voices of those who lived in shadow have carried the rest across generations. The wash house squatted behind the main house, a brick chamber always thick with the smell of lye and wood smoke. Inside, steam curled along the rafters as the 8 women moved like shades through the glow of a single tallow candle. Copper kettles simmered, sending up a hiss that hid the low rustle of skirts and the pounding of hearts. Amara ladled water into the great basin until it nearly overflowed, the liquid dark with bitter roots steeped earlier in secret. Grace gripped the heavy paddle used for stirring linens, her knuckles bone white. Ruth closed the shutters tight, shutting out the storm's wail and the chance of a sudden visitor. Elise entered as if summoned by the weather, her silk robe a pale flare against the dim. She carried a riding crop though there was no horse in sight, the leather tip tapping her palm in lazy menace. "Slow again," she began, her voice a blade. The words were cut short when Leah stepped forward, silent as the falling rain, and seized her wrist. Shock flashed in the mistress's eyes, a woman unaccustomed to resistance, and in that instant Dinah shoved from behind, driving her toward the steaming basin. Elise clawed the air, nails scraping Leah's arm, but the women held fast. The basin received her with a splash that drowned the crack of thunder. Steam rose in a sudden white shroud. Elise's scream gurgled into a wet choke as her face met the scalding water. Amara pressed down with the paddle, Grace braced her shoulder against the mistress's back, and the others closed around like an unyielding wall. The candlelight trembled across their faces, eyes fierce, jaws clenched, sweat mingling with the mist. Elise thrashed once, twice, a frantic dance of silk and limbs. Then the storm outside roared louder, and inside there was only the hiss of water. Folklore says the Teche River itself seemed to pause, listening. Some descendants claim lightning struck a cypress in the same breath Elise's body stilled, the tree splitting in a burst of fire that illuminated the washhouse door. Whether the heavens marked the act or merely mirrored the storm, the women stood frozen, breath ragged, as the water settled around the lifeless form of the woman who had tormented them. Minutes passed, maybe hours, time broken by the echo of their heartbeat. Finally Grace whispered, "It is done." The words carried no triumph, only the solemnity of a prayer. They lifted Elise's body from the basin, her silk clinging heavy and dark. Ruth fetched a linen sheet, wrapping her with the same care they once gave the master's finest tablecloths. Together they laid her on the stone floor, a pale figure amid the steam, her face turned toward the storm that had hidden their deed. Outside, the rain washed away the scent of scalded flesh, drumming against the roof like 1,000 muffled drums. No overseer came. The men in the quarters heard nothing over the storm, or perhaps they heard and chose silence. In that moment the 8 women felt a freedom as fierce and fleeting as the lightning that split the sky, a freedom not promised by law or war but taken by their own hands. Later accounts from neighboring plantations mention only a disturbance at Belle Rive, and the sudden passing of the lady of the house. Newspapers that week printed small notices of tragic misadventure, claiming Elise Boudreau had fainted and drowned while tending laundry in the tempest. Yet whispers traveled faster than print. Fishermen on the Teche spoke of spirits in the rain, and children of the quarters hummed a new verse to an old hymn, "Water washed the wicked, water set us free." The official record would remain thin, a charred page, a misprinted obituary, but the memory seeped into the bayou's soil and the marrow of those who survived. The basin where Elise died cooled to silence by morning, yet its water seemed to hold a different weight, as if the river itself had claimed the truth and would keep it hidden until someone came listening generations later. When we imagine that night, we must remember the slow, deliberate courage it demanded. These were women who had endured years of unspeakable cruelty, who knew the price of defiance was death by rope or fire, yet still pressed their hands against the arc of history and forced it, if only for an hour, toward justice. And so the question lingers like the storm's echo. Was this murder or a final, desperate claim to life in a world that offered them none? If your family carries a murmur of a storm-swept night, a name that vanished from the courthouse but lived in a whispered hymn, share it below and subscribe, because every story pulled from the dark waters brings another erased truth back into the light. Dawn came gray and swollen with mist, a pale shroud over Belle Rive plantation. The storm had scoured the air, but the washhouse still held the metallic scent of boiled copper and something heavier, a silence that seemed to echo. Overseer Samuel Kittredge was the first to discover the body. His diary entry for August 25, 1847, reads with unnerving brevity, "Mistress Elise Boudreau found deceased in laundry basin. Water scalding. Negresses present, cause uncertain. Beneath those few words lay the tremor of panic that swept through the plantation like wildfire. The alarm bell clanged before sunrise, its iron tongue summoning every enslaved soul to the yard. Rain pooled in the ruts of the carriage path as armed patrols arrived from neighboring estates, their boots slick with mud and menace. Word traveled down the Teche River faster than the current. The mistress was dead, and suspicion fell like a noose on those who worked the laundry. The 8 women stood side by side, eyes lowered but hearts drumming. No confession passed their lips. Not one whispered a name. The master of Belle Rive, absent on business in New Orleans, returned that evening to find his world tilted. Letters later found in a merchant's archive record his disbelief, his fury that savages had dared strike at his household. An example must be made, he wrote to the parish sheriff, lest this contagion spread to other properties. By nightfall, militia from Franklin and Centerville ringed the plantation, rifles cocked, their lanterns flickering against the cypress like floating eyes. Interrogations began at once. Overseers dragged men and women from their quarters, demanding names, striking with the flat of their blades. According to an 1847 report to the Louisiana Adjutant General, severe measures were necessary to procure testimony, a bureaucratic phrase masking hours of torture. Yet the women held their silence, each glance between them a covenant stronger than chains. Punishment rained down indiscriminately. 2 field hands, caught merely for murmuring in Creole, were whipped until their backs opened in ribbons. Children were forced to watch, their cries rising against the heavy dusk. Leah's husband was hanged from the old oak for withholding information, his body left to sway as a warning. The parish doctor, summoned to certify death, recorded only extreme laceration and loss of breath, his pen a cold witness to the spectacle of state-sanctioned terror. Still no confession came. The sheriff ordered all 8 laundresses confined in the stone smokehouse, a windowless cell where the summer heat clung like wet cloth and the air reeked of old meat and despair. For 3 days they endured without food, their only water the rain they caught in their palms when lightning split the sky. A neighbor's letter preserved in the Louisiana Historical Society notes, "The women remain obstinate as if possessed by some dark force." But those who knew them understood, it was not possession but a resolve honed by years of silent suffering. When violence failed to break them, officials turned to the law, convening a swift tribunal more spectacle than trial. Court minutes, later damaged in a courthouse fire, speak of evidence circumstantial, verdict inconclusive. The presiding judge, a friend of the Boudreaux family, declared the death an unfortunate accident brought on by domestic instability, a ruling that allowed the master to collect insurance on his wife's life while avoiding scandal. Justice for the state meant preserving property and calm, not truth. Yet the master's private justice was another matter. Oral accounts handed down in the quarters tell of secret retaliations, night whippings where screams were muffled with burlap, disappearances of men who dared speak to the 8 women, the sudden sale of entire families downriver. A WPA interview from the 1930s quotes an elderly descendant. "My grand say blood run in the cane that year but no paper keep it." By winter the 8 laundresses were scattered like seeds on the wind. 2 were sold to a sugar estate near Baton Rouge, 3 to a rice plantation in Georgia, the rest to distant holdings where their names were altered or erased. The smokehouse where they had waited in silence stood empty, but those who passed after dark swore they heard a soft humming, low, defiant, the melody of a river hymn. The plantation tried to return to its brutal routine, yet a shadow lingered. Neighbors whispered that Belle Rive was cursed. Crops failed the next harvest, floods swallowed the lower fields. A priest summoned to bless the grounds refused to step inside the washhouse, claiming the air tasted of ash and salt. Even Overseer Kittredge abandoned his post, writing in his final entry, "There is something unquiet here that will not be ruled." And so the official story closed with the fiction of an accident, the court ledger marked and shelved. But the real aftermath lived on in scarred backs, in broken families, in the echo of a song that defied erasure. The women's silence became their loudest testimony, a refusal to let the oppressor own even their confession. Today, when we sift through those surviving scraps, a charred docket, a merchant's letter, a doctor's cold notation, we catch only glimpses of what truly followed. Yet the bayou remembers. The Teche River still swells each August, dark and restless, as if carrying the weight of a secret too heavy to sink. If your family carries a fragment of that silence, an unnamed ancestor sold overnight, a hymn with no known beginning, share it below and subscribe. Every memory, every whispered name, helps call back the voices that history tried to drown. Autumn crept over St. Mary Parish with the smell of wet cane and wood smoke, and with it came the theater of law. An improvised proceeding meant less to uncover truth than to restore a fragile order. According to the parish docket of October 1847, now blackened at the edges from the courthouse fire decades later, a tribunal of inquiry convened to examine the unusual death of Madame Elise Boudreau. Those words, tribunal of inquiry, promised deliberation but concealed a spectacle designed to pacify white planters and terrorize the enslaved. The hearing unfolded in a cramped wooden hall in Franklin, where ceiling fans stirred the humid air like sluggish vultures. Candlelight glinted off militia rifles stacked by the door. Every creak of the pine floorboards carried the weight of power. Sheriff Duval called the accused by name, Grace, Leah, Amara, Dinah, Ruth and the others, but did not wait for responses. They were herded to a single bench, their wrists bound, their dresses still stained with the work of the washhouse. The prosecutor, a merchant's son whose own family held 50 souls in bondage, spoke first. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are gathered to ascertain whether malice or misadventure ended the life of Madame Boudreau." His voice was smooth as polished cane syrup, but his eyes held the cold arithmetic of property and profit. He recited fragments from overseer diaries, read aloud the terse discovery note, "Mistress found deceased in laundry basin," then paused for effect as if daring the women to contradict the official script. They did not. Not because they lacked words but because they knew words could be twisted like the hemp rope waiting outside. The court clerk scratched a line into the ledger. The accused remained obstinate. No mention of the bruises on Grace's wrists from the sheriff's earlier questioning, or the swollen lip Dinah carried from a guard's boot. Witnesses paraded through like actors on a warped stage. Kittredge, the overseer, offered a carefully measured account. He had discovered the mistress unconscious, possibly the victim of a fainting spell. He denied knowledge of foul play, though a tremor in his voice betrayed more than his words. 2 neighboring planters testified to Elise's delicate constitution, suggesting she might have swooned in the heat. Each statement wove a shroud of ambiguity around a death that was anything but accidental. When at last the women were asked to speak, silence thickened the room like a gathering storm. Grace met the prosecutor's gaze without flinching. Amara stared at the candlelight as though she could bend it to memory. Leah closed her eyes and hummed, so faintly the jurors shifted uneasily. The melody, later identified in WPA recordings as a river hymn, carried no confession, only a pulse of defiance. The clerk recorded simply, "Negro women mute. Refuse testimony." The judge, a friend of the Boudreau family and a frequent guest at Belle Rife's lavish dinners, leaned forward. His gavel struck the table with a crack that made the candle flames jump. "This court finds insufficient evidence of homicide," he announced. "The death of Madame Boudreau is hereby ruled an unfortunate accident." The verdict hung in the stagnant air, a careful fiction meant to protect property, avoid scandal and prevent the spark of rebellion from leaping beyond the cane fields. But the charade did not end there. Outside, a different law waited. Militiamen led the women back to the smokehouse, chains clinking like distant thunder. No record states what punishments followed, but oral histories whisper of night trials, private sessions where whips replaced gavels. A descendant interviewed in 1937 recalled her grandmother's warning, "Their silence was their shield, but it cost them flesh." The public outcome suited every white interest. The planter retained his insurance claim on Elise's life. The parish avoided headlines that might attract abolitionist scrutiny. The militia returned to their posts convinced they had crushed a dangerous ember. Yet the women's refusal to speak turned the official record into a hollow shell. By giving nothing, they ensured the truth lived only in the marrow of their people, beyond the reach of ink or fire. Today the surviving pages of that trial lie brittle and faded in the Louisiana State Archives, a few warped sheets that smell faintly of smoke and bayou water. Read them closely and you can almost hear the gaps, the spaces where testimony should be, the silence that thunders louder than any verdict. Their quiet was not absence, it was strategy, a final act of self-possession in a world built to erase them. The courthouse has long since been rebuilt, the judge's name etched on plaques, the clerk's descendants scattered. Yet when the Teche River floods in late autumn and the wind rattles the shutters of Franklin's old district, locals still speak of a low hum that rides the mist, a tune without words that lingers like a question. Was justice ever meant to be served here, or was the performance of law merely another lash, another mask for power? If you carry a family story of a trial where truth was silenced, of a verdict that hid more than it revealed, share it below and subscribe, because every whispered name and half-remembered hymn draws another forgotten testimony back into the light. Dawn broke over Belle Rive like a smoldering ember, the cane fields slick with dew and the heavy scent of burned wood hanging low to the ground. According to the November 1847 parish weather log, a thin fog rose from the Teche after an unseasonable night of warmth, but the entry ends there, leaving the rest to rumor and memory. By sunrise, the house's west wing was charred black, its shutters warped inward as if some private fury had pressed against them from the inside. The mistress was buried hastily that same day, a plain pine coffin lowered into soil still damp from the river's tide. The priest from Franklin's small chapel wrote in his ledger, "Service attended only by family and nearest neighbors. Negroes barred." The blunt phrase reveals more than the sparse record. It was not grief but control that shaped the burial. Enslaved workers, who had washed her linens and nursed her children, were ordered back to the cane rows before the final blessing was spoken. Life at Belle Rive did not return to normal, it congealed into something darker. Overseer Kittredge doubled the work gangs, citing the demands of the harvest, yet the 1848 agricultural census shows yields fell by nearly a third. Fields that once shimmered green grew patchy and brittle, as if the earth itself recoiled. A diary fragment from a traveling sugar broker notes, "Laborers slow, fearful. Whispers of the washhouse night carry on the wind." The master himself withdrew behind heavy drapes, emerging only for the accounts. His ledgers from that winter are scrawled in a different hand, perhaps his own, perhaps a clerk's, and margins are filled with erratic calculations. The price of molasses beside the cost of iron shackles, the valuation of human bodies beside purchases of candles and lime. Each page reads less like business and more like an attempt to cage a restless shadow. Punishments multiplied. According to a plantation physician's invoice dated January 1848, 6 treatments for lash wounds were billed in a single week. Yet no official punishment for the death of Elise Boudreau is recorded, only a private reign of terror meant to cauterize a wound that refused to close. A WPA oral history taken in the 1930s preserves a chilling memory from Leah's great-granddaughter. "They whipped them till the moon fell, but the women sang low, like a river moving under ice." Neighbors, uneasy with the stench of scandal, began to sell their parcels or drift toward New Orleans. The Parish Gazette carried a brief notice of declining fortunes in the Belle Rive district, never mentioning the reason. Yet travelers spoke of strange sights, candles flickering in the windows of the deserted washhouse, or a woman's figure walking the levee at dusk, her dress damp as though fresh from the Basin. By the spring of 1848, Belle Rive stood half abandoned. Rats nested in the granaries, shutters banged loose in the wind, and the great iron bell that once marked the workday remained eerily still. When census takers returned in 1850, they recorded barely half the enslaved population noted a decade earlier. Some had been sold south to cover debts, others, the records admit with reluctant ink, simply absconded into the swamps. Folklore filled the silence. Children in Franklin learned to hush when evening fog rolled off the river. Fishermen swore they heard a woman's hymn beneath the bullfrog chorus, a melody without words that tightened the skin like cold rain. An elderly midwife told interviewers, "That house carries a hum." Not a ghost exactly, more like a memory refusing to stay quiet. The plantation house finally collapsed during a hurricane in 1867, but locals say the soil remembers. Travelers who camp near the site speak of waking to wet footprints circling their fire, though no rain has fallen. Even the cane refuses to grow there, the stalks twisting brown before they reach a man's waist. In the brittle pages of ledgers and the soft cadence of remembered hymns, the aftermath of Belle Rive endures, a caution and a challenge. The court's verdict called it an accident, but the land tells another story, one written in soot and silence, in work songs that slip like smoke through time. And so the question lingers like mist over the Teche, when the records fall silent and the earth itself bears witness, whose truth survives. If you have ever walked land that felt heavier than the air around it, if a family tale still hums in your blood, share it below and subscribe, because every whispered recollection helps bring the buried voices of Belle Rive back to the living night. The courthouse in Franklin, Louisiana, was little more than a wooden hall with shuttered windows and a single brass scale mounted above the judge's chair, but in the winter of 1848 it became the stage for a proceeding so hollow it seemed carved from smoke. According to a fragment of the St. Mary Parish docket, inquest held concerning the sudden decease of Madame Elise Boudreau, proprietress of Belle Rive Plantation, November last. No mention of the 8 women whose names had already become a whisper through the cane fields. No formal charges, only an inquiry of natural causes, as if the basin of water had never boiled and the mistress's lungs had not filled in the dark. Witnesses were summoned with the clang of a handbell. The master of Belle Rive appeared first, gaunt and sallow, his testimony a careful architecture of omission. He spoke of his wife's delicate constitution, of fainting spells and a weakness of the chest, insisting that she must have fallen while washing linens. An excerpt from the Franklin Gazette, December 12, 1847, records his words almost verbatim. The lady was of frail health and inclined to sudden fits. No mention of the bruises found along her wrists, though an attending physician scribbled privately in his account book, marks inconsistent with a simple fall. The enslaved women were brought in one by one, not as witnesses to speak but as bodies to be inspected. A clerk scrawl lists their names as if cataloging livestock: Leah, Mariette, Celine, Ruth, Adele, Jessa, Doreen, Naomi. The court required no oaths. Enslaved testimony was inadmissible unless it confirmed the master's version of events. Still, when asked to describe the night, Leah is recorded as saying only, "The water was hot. The moon was low." The judge ordered the words struck from the record, yet the clerk's pencil shadow remains faintly visible beneath the ink. Lawyers spoke in long honeyed sentences about the natural weakness of the feminine heart and the perils of damp night air, while the women stood shackled at the back of the room, eyes fixed on the warped pine floor. According to a surviving page from the parish minute book, no evidence of violent intent was established. Verdict: accidental misadventure. The official stamp falls heavy, but the silence in the margins howls louder than any gavel. Outside, the crowd of planters and merchants muttered about unrest, about poisonings in New Orleans and whispers of slave uprisings in Point Capi. The New Orleans Bee reported only that Negro agitation is best met with firmness and discretion, a line as cold as the iron manacles that ringed the women's wrists. By dusk the proceeding was over. No sentence, no record of release. Parish tax rolls the next spring list 6 of the 8 women as transferred, a euphemism for sale to distant parishes where their names dissolve into ledger dust. Folklore clings to the gaps. One oral account gathered by the WPA a century later claims that on the night after the trial, townsfolk heard a hymn rising from the courthouse well, a melody without words that made lantern flames flicker. Another tells of a clerk who kept the suppressed notes in a cedar box and swore the ink never dried, the letters beating like sweat each summer. Whether true or shaped by time, these stories fill the silence left by a justice system built to erase. The trial was not a search for truth but a performance of power. Every phrase in the docket, accidental, natural, without malice, served to keep the machinery of slavery turning, to assure neighboring planters that nothing had slipped beyond their control. Yet control is an illusion. The basin still waits in memory, the water still roils in the minds of those who remember the night the women of Belle Rive turned silence into a weapon. If your own family carries the echo of a name that vanished after a courthouse verdict, if you've seen a page where the ink fades too perfectly, share it below and subscribe, because every memory spoken aloud drags another hidden record back into the light. By the close of 1848 the Belle Rive case existed only as rumor, its few written traces already flickering toward ash. A thin bundle of papers, trial notes, death certificate, witness summons, was stored in the St. Mary Parish Courthouse, but the ledger that once held the mistress's name now bears a singed edge and a single cryptic line, filed among miscellany lost to fire. Whether the blaze that gutted the records room the following spring was accidental or carefully kindled, no one dared to say. Local newspapers complied with an almost instinctive silence. The Franklin Gazette, which had initially printed 2 cautious paragraphs, revised its December 1847 issue for the bound annual edition, removing every reference to the Washhouse tragedy. An archivist who catalogued the microfilm in 1912 noted the curious gap: a single week where page 3 skips from society notices to a recipe for pecan pie, as though a knife had sliced out the heart of a story. Even the Catholic parish register bends toward forgetting. Elise Boudreau's burial is entered with a hurried quill stroke, her name abbreviated, the cause of death left blank, highly irregular for a family of her stature. Below the line a faint brown smear interrupts the parchment, a shadow that local lore claims is not mildew but the imprint of damp hands. For the 8 women, erasure was deliberate and merciless. Slave sale manifest from New Orleans in early 1849 list lot of 6 female domestics, mixed ages, with no surnames, only first initials that could belong to anyone. The federal slave schedules for 1850 record fewer than half the names known from Belle Rive's 1846 inventory. In plantation ledgers across the Gulf Coast, similar initials surface like ghosts, an L is CEJ, but none can be pinned to the women who carried the night's secret. Travelers who ventured through St. Mary Parish in the years after the incident described an unsettling quiet. One Mississippi trader wrote in a private diary, "The people speak of a drowning only when the wind is high. By morning they swear no words were said." Another account, preserved in a New Iberia family Bible, tells of a storekeeper who kept a scorched scrap of courthouse paper locked in a tin box, claiming it hummed like the low tide when touched. Suppression was not merely a bureaucratic convenience, it was the final act of domination. To acknowledge that 8 enslaved women had drowned their mistress would mean admitting that the machinery of slavery was neither eternal nor invulnerable. Instead, planters rewrote the narrative into a cautionary tale of female frailty and domestic accident, ensuring that their own terror never reached print. Yet the land refused silence. Cane cutters spoke of hearing muffled splashes in the washhouse ruins long after the structure collapsed. Children dared each other to approach the cypress grove at night, where the air smelled faintly of lye and smoke. A Creole ballad collected in the early 20th century contains a verse about 8 shadows crossing water, sung in a minor key that older singers claimed was older than memory itself. Today, professional archivists searching parish repositories find only scattered hints: a misfiled bill of sale, a parish tax roll with names crudely scratched out, a clerk's note that ends mid-sentence. These fragments, brittle and darkened by time, are the bones of a story someone fought to bury. They prove that silence is not the absence of history, it is evidence of a struggle to contain it. And so the question lingers like a low drum in the Louisiana dusk. When the ink is burned, who becomes the keeper of truth? The earth, the song, or those who still whisper? If you've ever found a name scraped thin in an old family Bible, if your elders spoke of a night the parish would not record, share it below and subscribe, because each voice that remembers forces the past out of the fire and into the light. The ruins of Belle Rive lie beneath a tangle of moss and cypress roots, the bayou's slow water folding over what was once a grand plantation house. The washhouse where Elise Boudreau met her end is long since reclaimed by the riverbank, but in the thick summer heat the air still carries a mineral tang, as if the basin's scalding water has never truly cooled. According to a 1919 survey map of St. Mary Parish, the acreage is marked only as abandoned cane ground, a blank space where wealth once bled from the soil. Time has tried to seal the wound. Fires consumed courthouse ledgers, newspapers rewrote their columns, and families who once profited from the Boudreau name changed their spellings or left the parish entirely. Yet memory is stubborn. In WPA interviews a century later, descendants of those 8 women spoke of dreams where water runs hot and moonlight gleams on iron chains. One elder recalled her grandmother's warning, "Never turn your back to the basin after dark, it remembers." Historians sift through fragments. A half-burned death notice, an 1847 agricultural census with 6 unexplained dashes where human names should be, a priest's ledger scarred by water stains shaped uncannily like a hand. Each artifact is less a fact than a pulse, proof that the story never surrendered to silence. What the courts called an accidental misadventure becomes, in these brittle scraps, an act of deliberate defiance. A message carved into the night by women who refuse to vanish quietly into ledger ink. Stand on the levee at dusk and the landscape itself begins to speak. Cypress knees rise from black water like knuckles. Egrets lift slow wings as the air grows heavy with the smell of cane and rain. Locals say that if you listen long enough, you may hear a hymn without words threading through the cattails, a melody low and steady, the sound of survival. It is not a ghost story. It is a reckoning. Because Belle Rive is more than a lost plantation. It is a testament to how the oppressed bent history's silence until it cracked. The women who drowned their mistress were denied their day in court, their names scattered and sold, but the act itself became an unkillable record, carried forward in soil, in song, and in the uneasy conscience of a region that still walks on bones. Every whisper that survives is a refusal of erasure, a living archive no fire can consume. If your family carries a fragment of a night like this, if a relative ever spoke of a name crossed out in an old Bible, or if you have felt a place breathe with a story untold, share it below and subscribe. Every memory you bring into the light becomes another line of testimony, another page that cannot be burned, another reminder that the past is never buried as long as someone dares to speak its truth.